Hello, thank you for coming. We apologize for the fact that I think the Facebook and Instagram pages informed people that this was a 3-hour talk. Happily, it is not. However, we're always happy to be co-sponsoring an event that was completely organized by the Southampton Historical Museum. Represented here by 3 people: Mary Cummings, who's the archivist and does a lot of other things; Tom Edmonds, who is the director. Some of you, mostly you know him; and Connor, who's the director of education. I just want to mention very quickly a few things that are coming up that we're doing, some here, some there. This should be interesting. Pearson versus Post, the Sataponic fox hunting case that made legal history. That is at the Historical Museum. You can pick all these flowers up. Martin Levinson in early April talking about the Tet Offensive. Tom Edmonds is going to host this wonderful program that we're doing for the first time, Beer and Books. Since it's serving beer, we can't have it here, but we can have it there. So, sign up for this one so they know how much beer to buy. Should be fun. Talking about history books.
Yes.
History books, yeah. So you know who our targeted audience is. History lovers. Okay. Joan Baum in May talking about Melville. That should be interesting. And Martin Levinson back here. And actually, Joan Baum's talk this time will be at the Historical Museum. And Martin Levinson's talk about slavery will be here on June 3rd. Hope you will join us for any and all of these programs. Connor is known to many of you. Perhaps some of you do not know who he is. So just a couple of words about Connor Flanagan. He was born in Flanders, so he's a hometown boy. And he attended Aurora University in Aurora, Illinois. He studied history, and he also minored in museum studies. And he returned to Southampton. And in, I think it was 2015, started an internship at the Southampton, then called the Southampton Historical Museum. Now, of course, it's the Southampton History Museum. And he's been here ever since. And he is now the director of education, so he leads tours. He is in charge of PR about programming. He works with artists on exhibits. He works on building and maintenance building issues, and he is the go-to tech guy when anything goes wrong, which we hope it will not today. Please welcome Connor Flanagan.
Okay, great. There you go. Everybody can hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, so thank you, Penny, for the introduction. So my name is Connor Flanagan. As she said, I'm Director of Education over at the Southampton History Museum. Primarily, I work with school children, and one of the main things that we do is we talk a lot about whaling, the whaling industry, and how it related to Southampton town in the mid-1800s and before then. So what we're going to talk about today is just that. But before we get into talking about the industry itself and the people that were involved, I want to talk a little bit about the whales. Can anybody guess or know the name of any of these whales we have up here right now? Sperm whale, exactly. Right there is actually on the logo of our museum. Pretty recognizable, known for Moby Dick and things like that. Anybody guess the names of the other two?
The right whale?
Right whale, we got him right over here. And this big guy?
Humpback.
Not a humpback, it is a bowhead whale. The first one we're going to talk about real quick is the sperm whale. Sperm whales were between 49 to 59 feet and 35 to 45 tons. If any of you are familiar with your average big yellow school bus, that is about 45 feet long. So these whales were even larger than your average school bus that you'll see going down the street. Their lifespan is about 60 years, and currently on the endangered species list, they are listed as vulnerable. So they are still somewhat endangered, but doing moderately okay. Does anybody know where these sperm whales live?
I was just in that area. It was in the Western area, which is South Pacific,
That's correct.
Red River.
And so far, that is very correct, but more accurately, kind of everywhere. So as you can see on here, all these little black dots are known locations for sperm whales to be living. So they're basically all over the world, in almost all the oceans, somewhat mostly around the shoreline, except in the Pacific, right across the equator right here in the middle. So these whales migrate and hunt for their food as they swim around the world. Does anybody know what they eat?
Octopus.
Octopus, not exactly octopus, but
Or squid.
squid, yeah. So they eat not just this giant squids as we famously know and heard of, but they also eat any sort of small fish, the squids, the giant squids, or any sort of thing like that. They are a carnivorous whale, unlike most whales that you sort of think of that are eating plankton and small little things like that. They eat big things with these big giant teeth that they have. They have to eat about 1 ton of fish or squid per day in order to maintain that giant size we were talking about. And they have anywhere between 18 to 26 teeth inside of their mouth. Now you notice in this picture, they only have teeth on their lower jaw. They don't have any on the top. And you can kind of see right here, there's little sockets that the teeth fit into. So their teeth aren't like ours where they're meant to grab and mush and chew it up. They sort of grab the squids and just choke them down almost like a snake how they eat, without unhinging their jaw. And it's sometimes hard to imagine the size of these teeth when you're just looking at it on a picture, but that's why I today brought us a real sperm whale tooth here, so you can kind of see how gigantic this is. At the end of the lecture, you guys can all come up and take a look at this and a few other items I have up here for yourselves. So now, these giant whales, here's a picture of it, a dramatized picture of it fighting a giant squid. And they dive up to 3,300 feet to capture these giant animals. And they can hold their breath for up to 90 minutes. So they'll breach to the top of the water, take a deep breath, and swim on down to battle these behemoths. Many of you will know the sperm whale, like I said before, from the book Moby Dick. This is the type of whale that he was chasing after. Granted, Moby Dick was probably about double or 3 times the size of your actual sperm whales, but still an enticing good story. The next whale we're going to talk about is the right whale. So now there are 3 different types of right whale. There's the North Atlantic, the North Pacific, and the South Ocean right whale. They're all mostly the same, but they are all considered to be some of the rarest large whales around today, and they are characterized by their giant heads, which take up about 1/3 of their body. You can see sort of right here how large they are. They are about 50 feet in length, about 70 tons, and can live about 70 years. And they are actually categorized as an endangered species with their population still going down. So the southern right whale is actually doing a lot better. They're doing fairly okay, but the North Atlantic whale, the one that used to live out in these waters, is dangerously low. They have only about 411 animals left in the wild. Does anybody guess where these live? I did kind of give that away by saying they live here, but...
I mean, the southern ones live down in southern part of Argentina, off the Valdez Peninsula.
Correct. So, as I said, the southern whales, they live down over here. The Pacific right whales lived in the Northern Pacific, and the ones that we're sort of talking about more so in this lecture are the Atlantic right whales, which lived along the coast up to Canada, and then down along over here by Europe and Northern Africa. They didn't really travel down too far, and once you get down here, they were a slightly different species. Let's see. They were the first whale that was pursued by the American colonists, and they were the most endangered of the 3 species, that being the North Atlantic. In 1949, they became internationally protected, and the populations began to grow and come back after being hunted for so long. But since 2010, they've actually started to decline again due to vessel strikes and getting caught up in fishing lines. So these animals are still very much in danger. The next one we're talking about here is the bowhead whale. Sort of gets its name by its giant bowed head that it has, little right on the head there. They are about 60 feet long, and they can weigh up to over 100 tons. Their lifespan is speculated at potentially over 200 years old. There's no exact evidence on how old they can be because they are quite rare whale to find and study, being that they only live in one certain area of the world. Can anybody guess where they live?
Off of Argentina?
Not exactly there. They live in the North Arctic. So pretty hard to get you up there. Yeah, and their population levels are least concern, and they're actually increasing. So these whales are actually doing pretty okay at this point. They're starting to come back and live pretty prosperously up there. In order to live up there, they actually have the thickest blubber of any whale, with it being between 20 and 28 inches thick around their entire body. They also have massive baleen plates. So how baleen works is it's essentially a giant feeder system where these whales will open their mouth just like that, swim through the water, take in everything, and then spit all the water out, and all the plankton and fish and krill and other things that get caught in the baleen, and they swallow it down to eat. Their baleen plates, they have over 600 in their mouth, and each one, the baleen on it is between 10 and 14 feet long. So they're quite massive animals. Who first hunted whales in America? Can anybody tell me?
Indigenous people.
Exactly. So Native Americans were the first ones in the Americas to hunt whales. So there is some sort of speculation about the exact time when people first arrived in the Americas. Common number is about 13,000 years ago, and about 10,000 years ago, people started arriving on Long Island and living in this general region. But oral history from local Native Americans and Native Americans throughout the North and South America have whaling in their histories for hundreds of thousands of years. It's been a practice that's been going on forever. Some of the tribes we have here on Long Island, you can see on this map. The local ones that we know about here that are still around today are the Shinnecox. There's also the Montaukets and a bunch of other tribes all along Long Island who all participated in whaling in some form or another. How did they hunt these whales? Can anybody guess? Exactly, right up there in the picture. So these Native Americans would go out in these small canoes filled with people and hunt these whales with spears and harpoons and bows and arrows. I have a quote here from 1605 when James Rosary, who accompanied Captain George Weymouth on a voyage along the coast of North America, he actually witnessed some Native Americans hunting and killing a whale, and he reported that the Native Americans surrounded the whale with their canoes and attacked with bows and arrows and bone-tipped harpoons attached to rope lines. So now, once these Native Americans would kill a whale out here in the waters, you can see the shoreline, it's not too far away. How do you think they got that whale right back to the beach? Because, I mean, you can't really do too much into it in the water right there.
Told it after he was dead.
They had to tow it right back in. Exactly. So they would kill these giant whales. This picture's not to scale. They would bring these whales and have to tow them all the way from however far out in the water they killed them, all the way back to land. An example I have here, this is not of a Native American kill, this is of American colonists, but an example of a whale that was killed 10 miles offshore in East Hampton. The quote says, "It took them about an hour of strenuous rowing to tow the body 1 mile. After 6 hours of backbreaking rowing, family and friends came out in small boats with food and water. Another 6 hours of rowing finally delivered the whale to the beach." So it took them that long to just get the whale once it was dead back to the beach. You can imagine how long it took them to actually hunt the whale. In the early times of hunting whales, this activity was pretty rare. Most of the time they would subside off of drift whaling, and just when a whale would die at sea and wash up on shore, it was a plentiful occasion, and they would go out and butcher the whale and do what they could. Actually going out and hunting the whale was an extraordinarily difficult thing, pre-European contact, and even in the early years of Europeans living in the Americas. This was an extremely difficult task. What parts of the whale were most important to Native Americans? Can anybody throw out some ideas of why Native Americans saw hunting whales as a great thing?
Fins and tail.
Good. Anybody else? Blubber?
Baleen, I guess.
Baleen. So some of the main reasons were for food. So they would actually hunt these whales, and the meat on them would be used to feed families and villages for huge amounts of time. I mean, we talked about how large these whales were, being over 70 plus tons. You can imagine the amount of food that you would get out of just one whale that would feed an entire village. Another really important part were the bones themselves, which were massive. You can see here, these are 2 rib bones. I don't know exactly what type of whale, but any type of whale that would be able to be washed up on shore and feed a village for weeks at a time would carry along also these massive bones that could be used to create tools. We in fact have one example back at the museum in our collection of a whale bone that was turned into a fence post. So they would be used for all sorts of different things, from small handheld tools to large things like fence posts. But many people had the idea when we talk about whaling here in the Americas that it was a newfound concept to a lot of the people that came here. But in actuality, hunting whales was something that happened all over the world for hundreds and thousands of years. There's some examples of people in the Basque region of Europe, which is right here in northern Spain and southern France, who hunted whales as early as 1059. The Japanese hunted whales as early as the 7th century. And Europeans were not new to this concept. They understood it. I have a quote here from William Bradford, who was a settler and mayor of the Plymouth colony. When he was first visiting the Cape Cod area, he said that it was like to be a good place of fishing, for we saw daily great whales of the best kind for oil and bone. So they understood and they knew the importance of whales, but the people who first came here and settled the Americas, they weren't professional whalers by any means. It'd be like myself going out and seeing a bunch of fish in a lake and being like, oh, this would be a good spot for fishing. I'm not a fisherman. I don't know how to catch these fish or what to do with them once I get them, but I can understand that's a good idea. So it was really a great marriage that occurred here in the Americas when the Europeans came and met with the Native Americans who actually knew the technical know-how of how to get these whales and how to process them, and the Europeans who wanted them to use for industrious purposes. Now, what were the reasons that the Europeans wanted the whales? Were they the same as Native Americans? Were they different?
I'm sure some of it overlap.
Some of it overlapped, some of it was a little different.
Oil.
Oil, exactly. The main thing, first thing I'm going to talk about was the blubber. So Europeans, one of the primary things that Europeans hunted whales for was their blubber. What the whales used the blubber for was as a thick, fatty layer of tissue under the skin that stores energy, insulates heat, and increases buoyancy. What people used it for was to create oil, which was turned into fuel. It was used in soap and lubricants, and sometimes in food. The next thing, or how was it turned into oil, was they would cut it off, and what we see here, as essentially, when I work with kids, the easiest way I can explain to them is large strips of bacon. And then they would be cut up and put into these items called tripods and cooked down. So the best way, again, when I'm talking to kids about this, is to explain taking a big stick of butter and putting it in a pot and heating it up until it melts down into a full liquid. And then they would use these tools here to bail out the oil once it was ready, and the skimmer to take out the pulp of the whale. And they would also most times use the pulp to throw back into the fire that was heating the tripod to keep the process going. The other reason why they hunted whales primarily was for their baleen, which we talked about a little bit before. As I said, it was a filter feeder system with these whales subsiding on krill, plankton, fish, and even sometimes birds that would get caught in their baleen. Now, if anyone isn't sure what baleen actually is, it is essentially almost really big strands of hair. It's made out of keratin, which is the same thing that makes up our hair and our fingernails and things like that. And we would take it out of the whales to use in various things. Does anybody know what the baleen would be used for by people? And here we see examples of some bowhead baleen.
Do they use it for dresses, for the inside?
Yes, exactly. So what we would use it for is in corsets, right here, in big hoop skirts and dresses like you were talking about, riding crops, anything that needed to be strong but bendy. And in the mid-1800s, things like corsets were all the rage in women's fashion. Almost everybody had to wear them. Pretty glad that nobody has to wear them anymore. They look horrendous and really painful, but it needed to be able to bend to your body but hold steady, which before the invention of plastic was an almost impossible thing. But baleen worked as a perfect tool for this.
Connor, I've heard of whalebone corsets. Would they actually be referring to baleen when they
Yes.
refer to
So if you read any sort of old books or anything like that, and some old terminology of talking about whale bone, what they're actually talking about is baleen, because they sort of mistook it as a bone when it really isn't. And then the actual whale bones, when we say that, we are more talking about like the rib bones and things like that you'd use for tools. So it does get a little confusing when you're reading about it. You're not super informed, because then you'd be thinking, wow, how do you get a bone in there? How does a bone bend like that? Very weird bone. One of the other main things that they hunted for was this. Can anybody guess what this thing is? Ambergris, exactly. So ambergris is a substance that's secreted in sperm whale stomachs to protect them from hard and sharp food. Now, as we talked about, one of the main things they hunted was giant squids. And giant squids are big, fleshy-bodied animals, but the one thing that's dangerous really on them is their beaks, these razor-sharp little beaks that are inside of them. So when these squids get eaten, the whole body is digested, but then they have a razor-sharp knife essentially rattling around in this whale's stomach. So it would secrete ambergris that would create almost like a kidney stone inside the stomach of the whale that would collect all these beaks. Now, they would never pass it wasn't hurtful or anything like that to the whale, it would just sort of exist in their stomach, and once they died, decomposed, this would float out into the ocean and float around the world. Or, once people started wanting to harvest it, once they killed the whale, they would go into the stomach in search of it. I actually have some examples of it here. So this is a chunk of ambergris that's hardened, and a piece right here is some fused together beaks. Now they are very small, again at the end people are more than welcome to come up and take a look at these closer. But why on earth would we want to collect this weird rock of stomach view from a sperm whale? Can anybody guess?
Was it used for perfume or something like that?
It was. So normally people have no idea. They ask me insane crazy things, especially kids. A little more educated here. And so this was actually used for perfume, because you can imagine when it's in the stomach, when it's wet and gross, it doesn't smell great. But when it dries, it actually has somewhat of a earthy, neutral tone to it. And also up here, so it was used in perfume. It is now illegal to use it in perfume because these animals are endangered, so you can't hunt them and use this product anymore. But they needed the smell still. So they fabricated a synthetic version, which I have some of up here.
Wow.
So again, at the end, people will be more than welcome to come up and take a whiff of this and tell me what you think it smells like. Now, one of the other things that we would hunt whales for was, specifically sperm whales, was something called spermaceti. Now, spermaceti was stored in the heads of sperm whales and is a substance that is oily and hardens to a wax substance. We don't really know exactly what these whales use it for. There's some speculation it has something to do with the buoyancy, and if they could harden it and thaw it inside of their head, it would help them dive quicker or surface quicker. What we actually harvested it for was it created the best, cleanest burning oil out of any sort of whale. So the baleen that you would get, or the blubber you would get, would create oil that was great and everybody loved and was used very well. But the spermaceti would create the best oil. It also was used in the best lubricants. It was actually still in demand up until the space race, where some sperm whale oil was used in the fine machinery on the spacecrafts that were going up to the moon.
Connor,
Yes.
when you say the best oil, how would that oil differ in practice?
It was the most refined, it burned the cleanest, and it was just of the best quality. And in fact, when you talk about measuring light in terms of candlelight, it might refer to like a light bulb is giving off so many candle lights. One candle light is a candle made out of pure spermaceti because it gave off the cleanest and brightest light. So now we're at the start of the industry of whaling. So the first record of colonists organizing to hunt whales in Southampton was in March 1644. Now when I say they hunted whales, they were actually going after these drift whales, which I talked about before, which were whales that died at sea and washed up on shore. And what we have here is, again, not really to scale, some men harvesting blubber and baleen and things like that from a whale that has been washed up on shore. They would remove the blubber and whatever else was needed from the body, and they would leave it to sort of rot away and wash away into the sea. Eventually, they moved into offshore whaling, people in Southampton created a thriving whaling industry, heavily reliant on Native Americans' help in order to do so. So what we see is the Southampton people realizing the importance of whales, how much this could really affect them economically and help everyone, and relying heavily on the Native Americans here locally to help them in getting this to happen. Much like you'll hear about them with farming and really any means of Europeans just surviving here on Long Island. Was a very symbiotic relationship at first. In 1672, native colonists began working together to sail after these whales, and by the 1720s, offshore whaling became really difficult as local populations started to dwindle. So this industry became so good so fast that all these guys were going out in these boats hunting these whales that all the whales offshore of Long Island began to sort of disappear, and it was becoming a lot harder. So whalers began to outfit single-masted ships called sloops to go out into deeper waters and chase whales. So as time went on, the Europeans became really reliant on this as an economic force and started developing better boats and better technology to go out farther and hunt more whales more aggressively at a faster pace. When captured with these ships, the whales would be towed back to shore, a little bit easier to do than paddling with the aid of these large sails. And if they were too far out, they would, to tow it back before the whale would rot or potentially sink, they would cut off some of the blubber and whatever they could harvest at sea and store it in barrels and bring it back to shore, which was not ideal because over time in getting the blubber from the ocean back to shore to be processed, it would start to degrade and it wouldn't give you as best of oil. You really wanted to cook it down and turn it to oil as fast as you could. So in the 1700s, commercial whaling grew exponentially and became massively important to the economics of the Northeast United States, and whalers began to travel as far as possible. In 1732, they began going up as far as the Davis Strait, which, as you can see here, is right between Greenland and the Baffin Islands in Canada. In 1763, they reached the west coast of Africa, and 1765 were around at the Azores, which is off the shore of Portugal and Spain. 1733, they reached down to the coast of Brazil, and by 1774, all the way down to the Falklands. So traveling far and wide throughout the Atlantic Ocean as time went on, going farther and farther away, hunting as many whales as they could. Because these journeys began to get longer and farther away, they had to create even better boats. So they started creating two-masted schooners to replace the single-masted sloops so they could go as far down as the Falklands and as far away as Africa in order to hunt these whales. So with these boats, they could go farther and go out for longer periods of time as they could hold more cargo, more crew members, and they could actually store more parts of the whale on the boat. And one thing that you're going to see here in the picture is we have these guys up front in the foreground hunting this whale. But in the background, we have this black, thick smoke coming off the boat. Now we have these sails, so it's not a steamboat. Does anybody know what this black smoke might be coming out of?
Rendering the blubber.
Exactly. So on these boats, they started to develop try-works. So when they wanted to process these whales at sea, they would kill the whales and eventually tow them back to the ship. And they would begin to cut off, as I said before, these essentially large pieces of whale bacon, which is just the big pieces of blubber, by leaning overboard with these large sort of knives and cutting them off and hoisting it up onto shore, which was an extraordinarily dangerous job. Because you can imagine at sea, the boat is thrashing around. There's all sorts of mess on the boat from processing this whale. And what's an animal that's in the ocean that gets drawn by the scent of blood? Sharks. And you can see in the bottom of this picture, there's a couple fins of some sort of angry animals that might be wanting to get a free snack. So this process needs to be done quickly, efficiently, and if you fell overboard, good luck. Here we actually have a picture from a movie that was called The Heart of the Sea, which was based on the story of Moby Dick that came out a few years ago. And you can see down here, so now it's a little dark, there is a whale they're processing, and they actually have these little planks that came off the side of the boat that they were standing on to process it, and thrashing around in the water are sharks going all sorts of crazy and everywhere. And also you can see on the boat right here is the head of the sperm whale, which they took off onto the boat to then try and get inside and get the spermaceti out of, which is a great scene when they throw a kid inside the head. Didn't really happen. They would just cut a hole. Good movie though. So as I said, they would create try-works on the boats, which were the try pots inside of these massive brick structures to cook down the oil on the boats. So yes, we had these giant wooden boats out in the middle of the ocean with big brick ovens cooking up a flammable liquid, which would then be stored in wooden casks in the bottom of a wooden boat. So fires could happen, and if they did happen, it was extraordinarily bad. So again, you had to be as efficient and careful as you could when working in these things, because it was very, very easy to have all sorts of mishaps happen, let alone worrying about disease or injury or anything normal like that when traveling the world. You essentially just were on a giant bomb sailing around the world. So as time went on, whaling became really important. It had a lot of good that was done, but there were some things that started to occur that hindered the progress of whaling. One of which was the American Revolution. What you have pictured here is a picture depicting the Battle of Long Island, which is one of the earliest battles in the American Revolution, which George Washington actually lost to the British. In doing so, the American colonists lost control of Long Island for the duration of the American Revolution. And the British actually used Long Island as a sort of base camp area. Because of this, the entire whaling industry on Long Island ceased, came to a complete halt. The whaling industry in America in general also came to a pretty abrupt halt as the British blockaded waters all around the Americas. As time went on, the war ended, whaling came back, we were all doing great, everybody was making money again, but then we had the War of 1812. The British come in again, whaling comes to another abrupt halt. But at the signing of the treaty again in 1814, and the end of the War of 1812, whaling was back in full swing, and we had the start of the golden age of whaling. From 1775 to 1846, the colonial whaling fleet went from about 300 or so ships to 730 ships. So it more than doubled its size. Trips to the Pacific became more commonplace, and now today if you wanted to sail to the Pacific, you would head down to the Panama Canal and cut right over, and it's still a long journey, but you could do it. But the Panama Canal wasn't created until 1914. So these men would sail from Long Island or Massachusetts or any of the northeastern whaling ports all the way down around the bottom of South America and up to the Pacific, or down around the bottom of Africa and through the Philippines into the Pacific. So quite a gigantic, long journey they would go on. So now this time is when the sort of classic idea of the whale ship that anybody would sort of think of comes about, where there are these massive boats with 3 or 4 masts, all this room underneath for storing giant bales of baleen and oil, a few small cabins for the crew to live in, and 3 to 5 whale boats per ship to go out and actually hunt these whales. So one of the more interesting things when talking about the whaling industry is sometimes not so much the killing of the whales and the processing and that whole part, but it's the stories of these captains and some of the lives that they lived. And with working at the museum, one of the more interesting people that I came across when doing research for this lecture was this man by the name of Thomas Welcome Royce, who was born sometime in 1816 and died sometime in 1877. Now, he was a whaleman from Sag Harbor and is actually credited with the discovery, quote unquote, of the bowhead whale. He was the first American to sail into the Pacific Arctic Ocean and go after these whales on July 23rd, 1848 with his ship the Superior, going right through the Bering Strait and going after these whales. He had so much success the next year, hundreds of more people went up that direction, and that began the great rush to get into the northern Pacific and Arctic Oceans. He also is credited with developing the rocket harpoon, the rocket-propelled harpoon, which you can see he did have a mishap with in this picture. He was off the coast of Spain testing out his invention and actually blew off his left hand, and they had to do emergency surgery on the boat to try and save his hand. Got back to Portugal, and they actually had to take off the majority of his left arm. But it didn't stop him. He continued to hunt whales and use his hopefully redefined rocket-propelled harpoons after this point. But eventually, actually in 1877, contracted yellow fever while out on a whale journey, and his crew left him in Mazatlan in Mexico, which is a coastal city near the southern part of Mexico, where he eventually died poor and alone. So a sad ending to Thomas Welcome Royce, who honestly led a pretty novel and historic. I do wish he had a hook hand, so looked more like a pirate, but still an interesting guy. The next one we have here, some people may be aware of, is Pierce Concert. So Pierce Concert was born March 17th, 1814, and died August 23rd, 1897. He was actually the son of two slaves born here in Southampton and grew up as for the first part of his life actually on this property as Nathaniel Cooper, who used to live here, was the owner of his mother. When he was 5 years old, he was sold to the Pelletreau family and began working on their farm as a farmhand. He wasn't technically a slave, as slavery was starting to become abolished. He was an indentured servant, so he was eventually going to secure himself freedom later on in his life, which happened when he was about 18 years old and began to go out on whaling journeys. As time progressed, he became a really great whaler and very respected here in the village. And on November 8th, 1843, he set sail in Manhattan out of Sag Harbor, captained by Mercator Cooper, the son of Nathaniel Cooper. And Mercator Cooper, captaining this boat, decided to pick Pierce as the boat steerer, which was an extraordinarily important position on this boat. And I just think it's a really funny coincidence or happenstance that these men who grew up simultaneously with one's father owning the other now are almost as equals going out on this journey to make really great history. As they go out on this journey, the first 2 years of it are normal, hunting whales and doing this and that. But in the spring of 1845, they began to make various stops at islands around the Pacific Ocean to look for fresh water, wood, and things like that. And they happened upon 11 shipwrecked Japanese sailors. They picked them up and began to decide to deliver them back to Japan. Along the way, they came across 11 more shipwrecked Japanese sailors and continued along their way to return them to Japan, which at this time was an extremely dangerous thing to do. And also pictured up here is Mercator Cooper. This was dangerous to do because at the time Japan was a closed country. This meaning they did not allow any outsiders to come into the country whatsoever except for the Dutch in one small port. So what Mercator Cooper did was, as they approached and they got closer, he actually let out some of the Japanese men on the small boats to go to shore to alert them of the American vessel's arrival. After some time, they were allowed to come in and dock inside of Edo Bay, which is now known as Tokyo Bay. And while there, they actually ended up meeting the Emperor of Japan, a bunch of other dignitaries, and a lot of people came on board the boat to welcome them and thank them for returning these sailors. What we have pictured here are what we believe to potentially be a picture of Pierce and Mercator Cooper. Not exactly sure, but we were given this picture recently and we were trying to figure out who they might be. You don't read the best Japanese.
Now,
But
where did these pictures come from, Connor?
they came from there's the Kobe University in Japan. They were in their collection there, and somebody had emailed them to Tom, alerting him of these, and so I decided to include them in this lecture here, which are really fascinating. And I had a friend of mine who speaks a little Japanese try and translate it, which he said was really hard because it's like old Japanese. But it said something about a black steerman, which I would imagine, who was the only other black guy in Japan in 1845? Probably Pierce. But when they were there, it was actually remarked where the Japanese people, who at this point had not really seen anybody like Pierce before. They had seen some white men coming through as traders, but they hadn't seen any black men before. So they actually, there's anecdotes of the Japanese people trying to rub the black off of his skin, thinking he was just dirty from the boat. And he also, Pierce was a noted really good singer, and sang to the emperor when he came on the boat, and everyone was very impressed with his really great singing voice. So he sort of made a little bit of a spectacle of himself, and he sort of became very famous and popular at this trip. Upon returning home, Pierce tried his hand at the gold rush, didn't really find too much success, eventually came back here to Southampton, started a family, was married, had 2 kids who unfortunately died tragically young. But he started a ferry business, which we have a picture here of him on his little catboat on Lake Agawam. He actually had a house right on Pond Lane, and he would ferry people across Lake Agawam so they could get to the beach for a few cents a ride. He was also heavily active in the First Presbyterian Church, where upon his death he left the majority of his money to the church in order for them to create Catholic education programs as the years went on, or Christian education programs, sorry.
What's that in the bottom left part of the screen, so?
Right here?
Yeah.
I believe it's just a fence post, or no, it's damage to the picture. This is from a glass plate negative from, I believe, the Moore Studio collection. And a bunch of their glass plates are fairly damaged. It does look interesting though. But as time went on, the whaling industry began to decline. The last commercially active port sent out their last ship, the John R. Monta, out of New Bedford, Massachusetts in 1927. So by this time, the whaling industry was dead. It was all gone after the 1800s. Does anybody here know why? There's a bunch of reasons.
Electricity?
Electricity,
Oil.
oil. All right, we'll go through it. You're all right. So, one reason was war. So there was a civil war in 1861, from 1861 to 1865, that vastly depleted just men who would go out on these journeys. After the mid-1800s, less and less people just wanted to do this or were physically able to go out on whaling journeys, so that just became very difficult. Also during the war, a lot of boats were damaged and injured, so it became really expensive to build new boats and get new boats to go out and do this. So this was sort of the first hit that the whaling industry took. Next was the discovery of petroleum, which was found in Pennsylvania in 1859. It replaced whale oil as the primary fuel here in the Americas. And if you were a businessman looking to get into the oil business, would you rather pay to build all these boats and finance all these whalemen to go out on a 5-year journey to maybe bring back whales, or dig a hole? Most of them decided to dig these holes and create these. Granted, I am making that a little easier sounding than it was, but it was much simpler than going out and chasing down these whales. One of the other reasons were a lot of the disasters that took place on whaling journeys, specifically when they got into the Arctic oceans. So, as they hunted these whales around the world, population started to dwindle. They had to go farther and farther and farther. Eventually, in the late 1800s, needing to go into the Arctic oceans in the above the Pacific Ocean. So it took an extraordinary long time to get there. And then once you're up there, you're in the Arctic. It's freezing. They have to get there in the summer, do all their hunting, and get out before the ice shelves come back in and destroy all the boats that are in there, or lock them in and trap them for the entire winter. In June of 1871, 40 ships went through the Bering Strait in search of the bowhead whale. By August, the ships had gone as far north as Wainwright, which is right there, and the Bering Strait's right here. So they sailed all the way around the world, come up through here to do all their hunting. As winds over Siberia shifted abnormally, it pushed the ice back towards the Alaskan coast earlier than expected. 7 ships escaped, but 33 were trapped in a 60-mile line of ice. So all these boats in a straight line, completely crunched in and trapped. 4 of the boats were actually completely crushed and destroyed by the ice shelves. As time went on, some of the boats were able to escape. By mid-September, 1,219 men that were trapped in these boats fled with their provisions and the smaller whaleboats dragging them through the ice and snow. They traveled 70 miles south and were eventually rescued by the ships that had escaped previously. There were actually no casualties in this, but the loss of money was totaled at about $1.6 million, with equating to today's money about $30 million of loss, which is a massive hit to these companies, which were mostly headed by a few small companies that sent out all these boats. New Bedford was hurt extraordinarily badly, which is one of the largest whaling ports in the Americas, by this tragedy. And most insurance companies couldn't pay to get these companies get all their damages paid for that occurred in this tragedy. Then in 1876, another disaster occurred, where 20 ships this time were going on their way up north, so half as many as previous. One was already lost earlier in the year due to bad weather, but all the other boats again got stranded. 300 men fled from the 18 trapped ships. Excuse me, one of the ships didn't get trapped, but 18 ships got trapped. 300 of the men fled and went south with their whaleboats. 50 men decided to stay behind with the boats in hopes that the ice would thaw or they could get out. The 300 men went south and were eventually rescued, but there were not enough supplies for the 50 men that were left back in order to survive. Only 5 of them actually made it to shore eventually when they decided they weren't going to be able to last, and they tried to get to the shore of Alaska. And only 3 of them made it through the winter. So there were 47 casualties in this disaster itself. Nearly 70 ships were lost in the 1870s alone, and surviving ships were almost all damaged in some way or another, creating massive economic damage. One of the other reasons was the declining whale stock. So as I mentioned sort of throughout this talk, whales were just hunted sort of abandoned. There was no idea of sustainability with the hunting of whales. If anybody knows anything about hunting today, there's certain seasons, and you can only kill animals of a certain size or weight. You have to be very specific about this. And that is done to protect the animals so they can be around forever, which didn't really happen with the whales. So as hunting got more efficient and possible to kill bigger and faster and stronger whales, these populations just took a sharp, sharp decline, which made it harder to actually hunt them. Another reason was the gold rush. So the gold rush occurred in California, and rather than the companies themselves switching and going towards making money in the gold rush like they did with petroleum, this was your everyday whalemen who would sign up on a whale journey. Yeah, guys, we're going to go hunt whales. Sail around to San Francisco and park there to get supplies, and then go off in search of gold, and leave your captain of the whale boat alone with half a crew to now go out and do all this whale hunting. So you get a free trip around. Or many people just leaving and starting off on their own journeys. Pierce Cox was one of those. Came back from a whaling trip and signed up with a bunch of other men from Southampton to head out and try their luck, rather than going out in search of whales that year. And then one of the other reasons, one of the biggest I think, are these next two, with the Industrial Revolution occurring. So with the growth of cities and textiles and things like that started to grow, people started to invest their money elsewhere in creating new jobs and new businesses. They started to pour their money into these textile factories or creating the railroad systems and primarily working with petroleum companies to do that rather than whaling. Another thing was Norwegian advancements. This is a man, an entrepreneur from Norway named Sven Fjord, not great pronunciation on my Swedish, sorry, who developed a lot of mechanized whaling technology and started to outfit whale boats that were steam powered and made out of metal versus wood so they could sustain more damage while out on the seas. So these American companies that have taken all this damage from these Arctic disasters need to reinvest a lot more capital to make the money back on their investments. So it became at a certain point where people outside of America just had better technology and it cost too much money to get back into the whaling race. So people, as I said before, the Industrial Revolution, shifted where they were spending their money. And so as this happened, the whaling industry just slowly declined until it was no more. Now there is still some whaling occurring today in the world. Primarily it's done for food. Almost nowhere they're using whale oil to power anything or light their houses. And primarily the whales that are hunted are ones that aren't as endangered, but things still do occur. There are plenty of whales around the world that are hunted that are endangered, that shouldn't be hunted. And there's a lot of efforts done throughout the world, not just here in America, to try and prevent this from happening. And that is the end of my talk. Fin, it's a fin whale. And I'm glad to answer any questions anybody might have.
Your expose stops around the turn of the century of the 20th century, correct?
Yes.
I kind of remember that there was whaling, major whaling going on up until the 1920s.
Yeah, that was when the last ship went out, was in the late 1920s. So they were still some places were actively attempting to be a part of the whaling industry, but they weren't getting a huge return on their investments. So,
And they were using sophisticated cannons.
yeah, so that was mostly was developed by that Norwegian man, Sven Fjord. So he was developing a lot of those. There were some Americans developing tech as well. And some companies opted to reinvest their money that way to create these mechanized tools. But as time went on, because of everything else that impacted, especially the declining whale stock, it just became almost impossible. So you would spend millions of dollars to create this fancy boat that could kill a giant fin whale or a blue whale in seconds, but you can't find it.
Right, they would can them right on the boat. Right?
Exactly, yeah. But then, and especially once the 1920s occurred and the whaling industry, especially in America, really declined, and then in the 40s and 50s and later on to the 70s, as animals started to become protected, it just completely fell off. Mostly protected, half because they were becoming endangered, and half because it didn't benefit anybody financially to even hunt them anymore. So there was really no pushback to protect them.
But I've heard recently they brought it back somewhat. Japanese?
So there are some places when they do hunt whales, it's sort of, it's classified as scientific research, which a lot of people do have issue with because are you really doing research or are you just hunting the whales to make money off of or use as food? And there's a lot of pushback. And most of the whales that they do hunt in these cases, where a lot of people, you'll maybe see a news story about whales being killed, the whales that they are hunting are not endangered ones. They're whales that are just as if we're hunting fish. They're just happen to be bigger. So people get sort of mixed signals with a lot of these things where, yes, it's bad, but also if you're going to complain about this whale getting killed, you shouldn't eat two fish. So it becomes a bit of a sort of a catch-22 in some respects. Yes?
Explain why the bowhead whale is called that. Why is it right?
Yeah, sorry. I had to speed through some of my notes. I had a time constraint. I didn't have my full 4 hours. So the right whale is actually called the right whale because it was the right whale to hunt, as deemed by the early Europeans that came here. Because when you kill any sort of whale, they're going to float pretty okay because they're all very fatty and buoyant. The right whale, however, because it has such a giant head and so much blubber on its small frame, it's extremely buoyant. So when it's dead, it will float in the water much longer than any other whale that you kill. A sperm whale, they were primarily hunted, or they were called a sperm whale. I don't exactly know why, but the spermaceti that is in their head, they did think at first was actually sperm. And so that would be sort of why maybe they thought to name it that. But when I was doing some research figuring that out, there wasn't really a clear decision on that. It is a weird name. Kids laugh when I'm telling them about it, and I can't really answer them. But it is an interesting question. Yeah.
Do whales, do they predominantly fight while they're being hunted, or are they very lethargic in the water?
So when they're being hunted, it sort of depends on the species of whale and all these sorts of things. But as you can imagine, these whales are swimming around. When these small whale boats approach, they're having 4 or 5 harpoons just jammed into their sides. So they get a little mad, and they would begin to swim away as fast as they can, sort of creating what some people refer to as a Nantucket sleigh ride, where these harpoons are stuck to the whale, ropes are tied to a boat. As the whale swims off, the boat is then pulled through the water by the whale. There's plenty of stories about that in books and movies where it's very dramatized, where they're flying for miles and miles. I doubt anything was really that crazy, but I'm sure it had to have occurred. But the whales definitely were not very lethargic. They wouldn't sit down and take it or anything like that. But it was almost as if anybody's seen matadors, where they stab the bull a bunch of times, and then eventually it slows down and they'll get close enough to finish it, which would occur with the whales. Just so happens rather than being on land, they're on water in the middle of the ocean. Yes?
Did one ship go out until it was, and kill whales until it was full of oil and then head back, or were there places where they would drop off their catch, basically, and other ships would transport it back?
So both. So, for example, the journey that Pierce Concert and Mercator Cooper went on when they met with the Japanese men and did all that, that was just a regular whaling journey. So they went out, returned these men home, and then went back and continued whaling, filled their boat, and then actually went to Amsterdam, sold everything there, and then came back home to Sag Harbor with their money. But there are plenty of other people who would come right back to Sag Harbor, and all the processing and everything would happen right here on Long Island in Sag Harbor. Which is also a lot of the reasons why some whaling captains didn't primarily live in Sag Harbor. They lived in Southampton or East Hampton or a little bit outside of the main area, because as you can imagine, it didn't smell good processing whales, because you're just cooking down fat and just burning bodies. So right at the port in Sag Harbor where all this would have been occurring, the captains who make all the money don't want to live there, so they space out a little bit. As time went on and there was less room, some more people had got closer and closer to the main area. Yes?
The ones they wash up on shoreline here, which type of whale is that?
So primarily, at first it would have been the right whales that lived heavily around Long Island, this area. Of course, it could be any sort of type of whale that was passing by. So sperm whales that did occur in this region, they could, depending on currents and things like that, wash up here, humpback whales, different things like that. But primarily, it would be something like the right whale because they were so buoyant. So once they died, they could float around for a few days. And they'd be floating around, and if the current hit just right, they wash up right on shore. And they also lived right offshore. So you could be on the beach back in the 1600s and look out and potentially see a school of whales almost every day swimming by.
But in the last 5 years.
In the last 5 years, if any sort of whale that would be washing up, I would guess it would probably be something like a humpback whale that's a little bit more prevalent in the area. Because as I was talking about before, with the right whales, there's only about, speculated as of November of last year, 411 of them left in the wild. So I would not guess that a northern or North Atlantic right whale would wash up on shore. But yeah, and there's like, I think over 100 species of whale. I don't know them all. So there could be a few others that could wash up that I'm not aware of. Yes.
When the Indians would take the blubber, was there a way to preserve it, or they have the food that?
Yeah.
What did they do with it? Do they all just eat it? And
So you would eat a lot of it right then, so they would create, cook it like normal, but you could also do things like salting it, smoking it, that would make it preserve for a long time. Any sort of common way to do that with any sort of food, same sort of situation. And then one of the main reasons why the Europeans didn't eat the whale meat was because it didn't taste good then. Because so the Native Americans had been eating whale for generations. So you notice with any culture that you have, somebody's used to eating a certain flavor, so it's normal and good and great, and then someone outside the culture eats it, and it's like, what's going on here? So that was sort of what happened with the Americans, where the Europeans only saw whales as a financial commodity, not as a food resource. So they just wanted the whale for the dollar signs. They didn't care about eating it, because that's what you got chickens and goats and cows and pigs for. At least in the mind of the early American settler. Yes, Judy?
Connor, they have a really long lifespan in comparison like to people, but do they have breeding grounds like the salmon out on the west coast go up the river, the Columbia River?
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure. I think gentleman right there might know a little bit more.
I'm sure because I visited the breeding grounds in South America. I was living in Argentina, and I was in the Valdez Peninsula, which is quite far south. And I ran into an expedition by National Geographic that was studying the breeding of the southern right whales. And we were able to observe it, and as a matter of fact, we were able to swim with the whales, which was quite extraordinary. I didn't know about the other whales or the other species of right whales, but at least the southern right whales predominantly breed off the coast of Argentina.
Yeah, the southern right whale is doing a lot better. I believe when last I looked, it had about 8,000 wilds out there swimming around, so doing fairly. They're still endangered and still at risk, but they're doing much better than the 411 North American. And I believe the North Pacific only had something about 100 or 200 in the wild. But yeah, they're still heavily endangered.
They have multiple.
Yes.
If you're really interested in seeing a large collection of artifacts, the Sag Harbor Whaling Museum has a very large collection of various artifacts pertaining to whaling.
Yeah.
They even have I don't remember what it was exactly. I think it was a type of map that wasn't as a regular map, and showed the breeding grounds and the times of the year that various whales would get together to breed. Very interesting. But anyway.
We have some really great examples of whaling artifacts at the Southampton History Museum as well. Maybe some of you saw our whaling exhibit a few years ago. They're not on display currently, but hopefully sometime this year we'll be opening another whaling exhibit that'll be outside, but the Sag Harbor Whaling Museum definitely has a lot more of the more obscure and really great stuff. We just have like a bunch of cool harpoons and some bones. But they're still really cool. Come see. Yeah.
Let's talk about today that we do here in the Long Island Sound, in the Sheepshead Bay area, it's more prolific sightings of whales. Can you comment on that?
So I'm not an expert on current happenings with whales, but I do know they are starting to come back slightly. As we were saying, a bunch of different species. The right whale, not so much. But also, I don't know if I mentioned before, the bowhead whale is actually increasing in its numbers. So there are some whale species that are coming back to life and prospering. I can't speak. But there are more whales around, and because of legislation that's been put through to stop unsafe fishing practices And to protect these whales, they're starting to come back. So we're starting to see them in the Sound, swimming around in the areas that you hadn't seen the last 30 or 40 years. Where originally they were from, they belong, and they should be there to benefit the ecosystem as a whole. But humans, as the sort of parasite that we are on the Earth, have ruined that in some respects in certain areas. But as I said before, it's mostly now, rather than hunting, it's just negligence that causes a lot of damage to whales, where fishing nets just left around and boats just full on running into them. Yep.
So are you aware of any specific nutrient or nutritional value that the whales had for the Native Americans, or even in the Saginaw area? Was there any evidence of consuming them as a...
Yeah, so I'm sure, so Native Americans definitely ate them all the time, when possible. And Europeans, I would imagine the lower class people would definitely eat it, and whenever they could get it, if you couldn't afford to buy anything or you didn't have a farm of your own, this was readily available and possible to get. And I don't know anything about the nutritional value of whale meat, but I imagine, like any other meat of a large animal, it's got a good amount of protein. Got to be pretty okay for you to eat. And from what I've read online, it doesn't taste good at all. It's just very weird. I don't know exactly. I wouldn't imagine it's not very gamey, but probably.
It's a delicacy in Japan, of course.
Yes, yeah. Some places it's a delicacy, but if any of you have tried delicacies of other places, not always the best. Try that weird 100-year-old egg thing. Wait. But yeah, I can't say exactly why it was like really good, but I imagine it's just there's so much of it on this one whale. If you had it, why not eat pounds and pounds of it? But are there any other questions? If not, like I said, I have some stuff up here. People are more than welcome to come up and check out.
All right, that was such a great talk. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I just wanted to mention there were just a few programs that I left out when I was telling you about what was happening. March 14th, here, a history of Irish dancing. That should be so much fun. We have a wonderful woman doing that. March 13th, a woman who's a curator, a historian, talking about the book called 9th Street Women, which some of you probably read reviews of this book in the Times. It's about women artists who were painting basically, I think, in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and that should be an interesting talk. On March 20th, the not-so-gilded life of the Gilded Age wife. She is a good speaker. That will be here. And the last one is a talk about Marilyn Monroe, and that will be here as well on May 2nd. So we have all these flyers. Do come to visit us and take a copy of the Southampton History Museum's little spring brochure that just came out. So Connor, on behalf of all of us, here's one of our library bags. Thank you again for a wonderful talk.